I hope you can all hear me. All right, so we want to quickly go over the solution that we are currently working on. Um, Mine hasn't changed from the last time you saw it, so I'm just going to quickly pick up from where we left. And then, yeah, do we have any questions though? I think only one person has reached out with their solution. That was Ephraim, I think. I haven't heard anybody else coming through. Are we all good? Do we have any questions? How things are going? I guess not. Right. Okay, that's fine. Right. So, picking up from where we left, I think I'd done my registration class. One thing that I wanted to mention also that I forgot to is that I'd encourage you to build your solution continuously so that you can address any errors if you have any. Um, Quickly instead of waiting until you've done too much and now you don't know exactly what you want to fix and where. So after creating a class and implementing it, you might consider just going and building a solution and check if you've got any errors. Mine is still good, which is fine. Um, and I done registration. We talked about implementing registration. Um, yeah, we have work to do here. I'm gonna leave this empty. If we go back to our solution, I was now doing the registration list class, which is a list of your registrations, a list of registration pointers. It's got a straightforward class. It's got a list of queue list of registration, add registration, destroy is registered. And we talked about these two functions yesterday when I said this is where we talk about reflection. Um, but for now, I am going to skip that a little bit until we're all comfortable with the solution, and then we'll touch on reflection. So to do that, I'm just going to go back here and go a new, no, here, a new class. This one is now a registration list. Okay, finish. So depending on your version, see, this one automatically adds my classes here. The other versions don't. So you might have to Control V and paste your new class names here. I think I saw this yesterday when I was looking at someone else's solution. So please just be taking note of that. All right, so registration list is, we need to include a queue list here. Include a queue list. We need to include registration, and our registration list is going to have a registration here. So we can go private queue list of registration pointers, and it's called, according to the diagram, they have called it attendee list. I'm gonna just keep it like that. There it is. And then for your functions, you've got void add registration, which takes a registration pointer. Like that. You've got the destructor. Um, there you go. You've got is registered, which takes a queue string. You've got total fee, um, which takes a queue string, and you've got total registrations, which takes a queue string, like that. That's your list there. So add registration, according to the question that we are doing here, they say that no two registrations are allowed to have attendees with the same email address unless the names are different, right? So that means your add registration function must check if there's no other registration with the email and same name. So in other words, you cannot have the same registration with the same name and email. But if they name is different, then you can have the same email. So it's pretty much name email combination cannot be the same. So what you can do is, so if we go back to your sorry, I don't want to see that. Okay, so if you go back to our function list here, we've got this function is registered, which checks if we've got a registration with the same name. Right? So, okay, you should be able to query the registration list whether a name, person by name is already registered for a conference. So you can check if a person is already registered by name. So you can't really use this function because you will need to check if same email address. So let's go back here. So one way of doing that is you can just loop through your registrations and check if you've got any with that name, because inside registration, you've got a get attendee function, which allows you to get a person, and you can simply check if the name and email already exists. So that means what I can do here in my registration list is just loop through my registrations. Now, there are different ways of looping, right? You can use a for loop. You can use a for each loop. You can also use an iterator. So find out the three different ways of looping and figure out which one you want to use for looping. Of the three, I think both are fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of choosing which one you want to learn how to use. So in this case, if you're going to use an iterator, I think you can go, what is the dot? Okay, I'm not getting what I wanted to. Attendee list dot okay, I wanted to check something. Okay, I forgot. Right, so I need to check if there's an iterator function that I can just use, but I forgot how to do it. Anyway, let's just use a for each loop for my solution. A for loop is also quite easy to use. If it's more like a for each. So I can say for each registration, I cannot use R here because it's already available. I just want to go A inside your attendee list. You want to check if a dot get attendee dot get email is equal to r dot get attendee dot get email. So if it's the same email address, you want to check if it's the same name. So I can just do this here. So I can just go and a dot get attendee dot get name is equal to a dot get attendee dot no sorry r dot get attendee dot get name. So if the email and the name are the same, then don't do anything. So in other words, you only want to add a registration if this is not equal and this is not equal. So both, sorry, let me just revise my logic here. So if the email is equal and the name is equal, then you don't want to add this registration. Otherwise, you can. If the name is not, if the email is not equal, then it doesn't matter if the name is equal, you can still add it. If the email is the same, but the name is different, you can also add that registration. So do your if statement the way you want. I'm going to do mine like this. I'm saying if both the name and email are equal, then don't do anything. So for this condition, I can simply say if not equal. So if, right, there are two options. I can say just keep looping, else, edit. That's one way I can do that. Or I could say, put this in brackets and say, if it's not this, then add registration. Else, just ignore. I hope my logic is right here. So whichever way you want to do your if statement, but at the end of the day, you don't want to add a registration if there's already the same registration with the same email and same name. So just figure out which way you want to do it. So I'm just going to go with this one. So if name is email is the same, name is the same, and it's not that, then just go and add the registration. So I can go, I can do list.append my registration. Otherwise, I don't need to do anything. You can show a message, you can do whatever you want to do. In this case, I'm just going to leave it like that. So the only time it adds a registration is if it doesn't have the same email and name. Sometimes if you want to be case sensitive, you can just go lowercase everything so that you compare the lowercase versions of everything, just in case, because strings, if the case sensitivity is different, it doesn't say they're equal. So those are some of the things you can update and change. Otherwise, that's all this is doing when adding a registration. The other function that you want to implement is get booking date, which just returns the booking date. So this one is quite easy. Okay. Where am I? Get booking date, this one. Registration list, sorry. The destructor simply destroys your list. So this should be easy. You can use the kill, delete, all function and delete everything in your list. Is registered, checks if there's a user with the same name, with this name inside your list of registrations. So you can sort of like do the same loop as this one and simply say, if the, okay, let's do that. You can say if the registration's name is the same name as that, name is equal to name, then return true, which means there's already a registrant with that name. Here we are comparing the name that has been given, which is N. So if we find a registrant with the same name as this one, we say return true. If this doesn't return, we can just return false at the end here, which means this function will return false if we don't find any registrant with this name inside this whole list. Okay, that's that. Then total fee and total registrations. Now, these ones, that's where we need to do a bit of reflection here, because I'll explain. Let's just do it for this one, and then we'll come back to it. So the question says, go through your registrations, right? So if I look through these registrations that I have, for example, I'm going through all the registrations here. I need to calculate the total fee of registrations of this type. So remember, T can be equals to standard registration. It can be equal to student registration. It can be equal to guest registration. So the biggest question then becomes, if I loop through all my registrations, how do I know what type this registration here is? Because, for instance, your logic can be something like double standard equals 0. You can go student equals 0 and guest equals 0, right? Or let's just call this total. Standard total equals 0, student total equals 0, and guest total equals 0. So the idea is, as you loop you want to increment the total based on what type of registration this is. So in other words, you want to be able to say, if this current registration is equal to a registration, then you want to add the fee for this registration to standard. So in other words, you are going standard total plus equals r dot get, let's calculate fee, like that, right? And you're going to do this for all of them. So you're going to, if it's standard, if it's guest, if it's student. So here I can say if it's a registration instance, then add this total to standard. If it's a student registration instance, then add the total to student total. If it's a guest registration instance, then add the total to guests total. That's what we want to do here. So the question is, how do we know what type of registration this is? And why do we have to figure this out? Remember, your list is using a point of type registration. And if you remember your programming well, it means in this list, we can add instances of registration. We can also add instances of student registration. If I had done my guest registration here, we can also add instances of guest registration into this list. But this list uses a pointer of type registration. So when going through registrations in this list, how do we know what this instance is? Is there an instance of a registration or a student registration or a guest registration? So how do we figure out what type of an instance this registration is? So for now, let's just go qstring r equals, let's just leave it as a blank, right? So yeah, let's leave it like that. Oh, I've used it already. Okay, let's go type. And then we can say if type equals that, or if type equals that, or if type equals that. Right. So I think you can see the idea that we need to do here. The biggest question is, how do we figure out what type of registration array is? So that's what we need to figure out. And we can assign that to type. Once we figure this out, then this code is going to work. So this code doesn't need to change. And we are not going to change this code. We simply need to put some code here, which is going to help us to figure out what type of registration this is. One way of achieving this is to simply go in registration and add a type variable. And then put a get type function here. Actually, just string get type like that. And what we then do is inside the constructor of registration, we simply set type to registration. Inside the constructor of registration list, we simply set type to registration, to student registration. So the get type function will simply give us what type it is. But this is not what they want. This is another way of doing it, but this is not what they want. This is not how they want you to do it. So if we were going to do it this way, it means inside the constructor of registration here, we were simply going to add another variable here, type, right? So that you can assign the type of your registration. Or we could just make it public. It depends. There are different ways of doing it. And then we can say set the type. Let's just say T here, for example. Set the type to whatever T is. And whenever you make an instance of a registration, you have to specify the type, which means inside here, what you would simply do is you set your type to registration. So actually, in this case, you would simply set your type to registration. And then in student registration in here, what you would do when implementing your registration is when you call the constructor of registration, you would also set the type to student registration. So the type would always be whatever you set it to be. But anyway, let me not go too deep into this solution because that's not how you are required to do it. But I'm just trying to show you that another way could simply introducing a type which you can set through here, or you could make it a public data member. It can be accessed by the subclasses and they can set the type to themselves. So it all depends on different ways you can use to know what instance a registration is. And if we were doing it that way, we would simply then go here, type equals r dot get type, like that. And then this code would work. But the question says, you need to figure this out without using this way. So you're required to use Qt's meta object system to figure this out. So that's what we need to talk about, but not today. Let's leave it like that. So this code is not going to work. For total fee is always going to return 0. So what we can then do, actually we didn't finish here because remember, your function should return the total fee of this type of registration. So we don't need 3 totals here. Sorry, we just need 1. We just need a total here equals 0. And just go total here. And we just go total here. So in other words, you only add your total if the registration is of the required type. So if it's a registration, then you simply calculate the totals of registration. If it's in registration, then you do it this way. So if statement is only going to calculate the total fee of only one type of registration. And then you return total. But now here's a problem. The question also requires you to calculate the total fee of all registrations, right? Which means you can also, the type can also be all. So what you sort of like need to do is something like if type is equal to all, then just go total, plus equals r dot calculate fee, like that. Else, then do it this way, like this. So I'm sort of like having these if statements here. So if you say all, it just calculates the total for this registration without requiring to know what type it is. But if it's not all, then if it's registration, then do the calculations. If it's this, then do the calculations. If it's this, then only do this. And then you return your total. So that's like basically what you're doing for this function. That's also what you're doing for this function, total registrations. The only difference is this one is a count. So what you're simply doing is if it's all, you're simply going count plus plus. Otherwise, if it's this one, you're going count plus plus here, count plus plus here, count plus plus, sorry, here, and then return your count. So what this is doing is it's saying, if I've been given a type of registration A, then only count for registration or student registration or this one. So let's go back to the question. I don't want to confuse you. Any questions, anybody, if you've got? So you can request the total registrations fees for a type, right? Registration, this or that or that. So the variable that we are getting here, let's go back here. T can either be registration, student registration, or guest registration, right? So in other words, we are saying if T, yeah, you guys are not following. The type is what we are being given here at the top, not this type I introduced here. So it should be if T is equal to all, then do that. If T is equal to that, oh, okay, she's here. Okay, perfect. Let's continue. All right, good. So I was saying, let's come back to our function here. So remember, our function should receive a type and only return the total for that type. I was trying to demonstrate that if your type is equal to registration, so this is wrong because then we are just, this won't work. So what we want to do rather here is that if your type is equal to the type of your registration, which is this one, then you want to calculate the total. So in other words, your if statement should be if T is equal to your type, then you should calculate your total. So total plus equals to dot calculate fee, like that. So the question is, how do we figure out the type of the current registration? So that's why I said, let's just do Q string type here. And then here, let's go type equals that. So we need to figure out what type of registration is this? Is it a student registration? Is it a guest? Is it a standard? So this information, we actually need it here, right? We need to figure this out. And then we can say if the type requested is equal to the type of our registration, which is this current registration, then we calculate the total. And then eventually we return the total. So that's kind of like the correct logic here that we should be employing. So I'm just going to copy paste this part here and use it. What did I copy else? Okay, here. Only that this is a count. So like this. So we are saying we are given a type, and if type is equal to all, this one, right? If T is equal to all, then just count everything. Otherwise, if T is, in this case, it's A, if A is equal to all, then you can do your count. So this becomes count plus plus, like that. And then you return your count. So that's sort of like the logic we are following here. So you give this function a type of registration. And this type, remember, it can be registration, or it can be student registration, or it can be guest registration. In other words, the class name, because that's what we want to figure out. What type of instance is this? In other words, what type of class is this? Is it a registration or a student registration or a guest registration? So you can see I'm using the class names here. That's what we want to figure out here. What type is it? But once we figure out this type, then this code doesn't change. The only thing is we don't know what type of registration this is. And then to do that, we're going to use QtSmet object system. But otherwise, that's all when it comes to implementing your classes. So the only thing we haven't done, which we'll do later, is using this meta object system to figure out what type of registration is when we are looping, so that we can do our count correctly. So if the type matches the type that has been requested, then we count. Or if it's just all, then we just count everything. And that's it. So sometimes people go a dot to lower equals all, so that it doesn't matter if someone goes or like that. It all just counts. It all just works. So this just converts it to a lowercase, so that you can do it for any case that's used by the user. Yeah, so so this here, you might want to do in places like here, just make it lowercase for everything, or yeah, places like here, places like here, make everything lowercase, places like here, make everything lowercase so that it matches even if the casing is not exactly the same. Pretty much, these are my classes. The only one I haven't done is guest registration that I'll do later on by myself because it's similar to student registration. So once you've done this, that means I have implemented my all my classes here, my person, registration, this, and that. The next thing to do now is the graphical user interface, which is now going to allow me to add a registration. So coming back to your registration list here, your user interface should allow you to call this function and give it a registration, right? And your user interface should also allow you to call these functions to check if a user is registered, to check what the total fee is, to check what the total registrations are. That's what your user interface should do. Now, a registration requires you to add a person. What I don't see in this whole solution is how do you set the booking date? I think that's something that was overlooked when it comes to this diagram and dates. Here we simply see the booking date function, but I don't see where you set the booking date for a registration. Yeah, so that's something you might want to include, which was not already covered by this diagram. In this solution, you have no limit to the number of bookings per day, which makes it simpler. But I think you just need to factor in a booking date or just remove it completely. Just get rid of it. Again, those now, that depends on what you want to do. So you can either go and include a booking date or you can just go and remove it completely. But I think it does make sense if you include a booking date so that you can show registrations per date. Or we just got disconnected. Try to reconnect. What's happening here? Okay, so anyway, that's so when it comes to designing your user interface, that's why I'm saying you guys go and create a user interface that allows you to solve this problem. And remember, there's no restriction as to how you're going to do your actual user interface. You can, but my recommendations though, for creating a user interface, since you are going to need to have some XML writing here, you're going to need to do some XML reading here. You're going to need to do some, this won't affect your user interface really. This doesn't affect your user interface. The only questions that will change your user interface are question 2 and question 3. So think about how you want to do it. Usually a queue main window is fine because you can include menus and extend it like that. It also does add a little bit of some complexity because you might also have to include more dialogues. Or if you want a simpler solution, just do a queue widget. And you can just add buttons for all these other functions for reading XML and creating XML. I don't think they added any recommendations for menus here, like you should have a menu. They didn't. So it'll be an easier user interface if it's just a queue widget. I would appreciate if it has a menu, but that again does introduce a little bit of some complexity, which you might not want to deal with. But if you want to do it that way again, there's no problem. You can still do it like that. It just depends on, just choose your options. And whichever way you go for, stick to that and we'll help you. But moving forward, just create a user interface that allows you to follow all these, to carry out this functionality. So in a nutshell, before I close this lesson, because from today, I need you guys to go and finish off your classes, which are these ones, and then sketch your user interface and figure out how you want to do it. And then once you know how you want to do it, it'll be easier to then wire your user interface together with your classes. But in general, what you're going to do is, let's show this thing here quickly. You're going to have your GUI. Let's say this is your your GUI. Just do it correctly here. Let's say this is your GUI. There you go, which has everything that you want. Like, I don't know, it's gonna go with menus, and you can have some stuff here and whatever and whatever. That's user interface. And you have stuff going on here. You've got some buttons and some boxes and some drop downs, maybe, depending on how you want to do your user interface, and some buttons there. Uh, your user interface is going to directly use your registration list class. Registration list class. And to add a registration, let's say this is your add registration button. This is going to call the add registration function of your registration list, right? Because that's how you add a registration. And to the is registered function is also going to have some sort of button here that says, check if a student is registered, but the check would use that function, the add would use that function. So you're going to have an instance of a registration list inside your GUI, which you then use to maintain a list of your registrations. So if we are going to draw a UML class diagram, we are saying your GUI class, here, under private, probably you're going to have a registration list, reg list, which is an instance of registration list. That's under private. And then under public, in your class, you're going to have a whole bunch of functions that are going to be manipulating and using this registration list instance inside your GUI. That's the idea behind these solutions. So you won't really, so let's talk about that in more detail once you've got a user interface. Let's start with the user interface. Design a user interface that allows you to add a registration, check if a user is registered. You're simply just doing what's in here. You're making a user interface that allows you to add registrations, check if a user is registered, calculate the total fee for all registrations, and count all registrations per given type. So make that user interface. Your user interface is going to have an instance of registration list, and your user interface is going to be calling these functions, right? And as you can see, your add registration requires an instance of a registration, which means within your user interface, you have to make an instance of a registration and then add it to your registration list using this function. I know it might not make sense right now. So next step is to actually create a user interface. And then we'll talk about how you can use an instance of a registration list within your GUI to achieve all these operations. So pretty much almost all these functions should have like a button or a menu item, something that the user clicks to add, to check, to calculate, and to count. So these are all operations or actions that the user must be able to perform. All right. I think that's it. So let's go and do that, and let's keep in touch. But for now, you can simply go and define your classes, implement them, and then start on the GUI. It should take you just a day to design the GUI manually. And after that, we should then start talking about linking your GUI to your user interface.